Good morning. My name is Betsy, and I'm principal of Williamson, an architecture practice in Toronto, Canada. Thank you to the New Zealand Institute of Architects for the invitation to present my work today, and to Metalcraft for sponsoring the talk. Trying to condense your work and advocacy into an hour's talk is really tough. But given this is a group of peers, I'm taking the opportunity to discuss the bridges between ideation and realization, showing the ideas that can be sustained as a thread through the projects, as well as what the end result looks like. Williamson is a partnership not only between myself and my husband Shane, who currently directs the master's program at the University of Toronto, but also a partnership with the rest of the team, the core members being Eric C., Sonia Ramundi, Dimitra Papantonis, and Irina Solup. Without them and many others over the years, none of the work that you see here today would be possible. The overarching challenge that we've presented ourselves with is to maintain a critical practice that is also a professional practice, where clients will bring projects to us and feel confident that our criticism doesn't override their own desires, balancing client interests with our architectural voice so that what we need to do and what we want to do can actually become the same thing. At the beginning of each project, we establish a methodology of working by defining the rules that we are going to challenge as we work through the development of spaces and how they relate to their context and materiality. By establishing these methodologies, we're declaring that the critical aspect of architecture and discourse is significant, and the client understands that we will be bringing this criticality to the project. Often in our practice, it is a set of limits that starts to define the establishing methodology of the work. So it's not about what you can do, but what you can't do. A number of years back, the City of Toronto limited the heights of flat-roofed buildings, so we developed a project with a pitch that had these carved light wells subtracted from it. We parametrically associated the geometry of the cone with the various construction systems that we figured would be most buildable, looking at dimensional lumber in particular, and using the digital model to ensure that we had control over the lengths of the members, structural capacity, and things like that. Limits can range in scale from broad regulations like zoning and building codes to the minutiae of the size of dimensional building products. For example, the number and thickness of laminations in a piece of airplane plywood. Sometimes the limits are more esoteric, like the learning curve involved in folding new technologies into your practice, either on the design or the fabrication side of the equation. I bridged the digital gap while in school, so I was trained by hand, but have developed strong digital skills so that I'm never far from the means of production. And everyone in our office kind of shares this kind of bridge between hand and digital programming and things like that. These slides have just shown two of our sweat equity projects that tend to happen early in your career. It was an exhibition space that we designed and fabricated ourselves out of CNC foam, and it's today I'll show a few projects that range in scale from the large to the small in terms of these establishing limits. So this is where I'm from. I was raised in Chicago, and 20 years ago moved to Toronto when Shane got his teaching position at the University of Toronto. And the city of Toronto is the fourth most populous city in North America and the largest in the Great Lakes region. We're located on the northwest shore of Lake Ontario, as you can see highlighted, and in the associated region known as the Golden Horseshoe, which contains over 26% of Canada's population. Now, this may seem like a really impressive number until you realize that Canada has a smaller population than the state of California. So what we have is a huge amount of land. Canada is a natural resource economy. Softwood lumber, oil, water, and natural gas are abundant resources and major exports that are primarily sold as raw commodities, especially in the timber industry. So even the back of the dollar, when our dollar used to be paper and wasn't a coin, it shows a log drive in the shadow of the country's Parliament building. And you can see on the right that while Canada is a fairly small consumer of wood products, we're actually the second largest producer of the raw material next to the United States. So of course, Canada has a long history of building in wood. indigenous peoples developed rich building traditions thousands of years before the arrival of the first Europeans, which continued through the beginnings of colonization with Champlain's habitation and into 19th century industrialization. Timber is really important. These stills were taken from a NASA computer model depicting levels of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere over the course of a year. The animation is on YouTube, and it's mesmerizing. The carbon dioxide is shown in red. And in the northern hemisphere, you see the highest concentration over the major emission sources. And the seasonal changes, what's shown here, is actually the amazing part. So the left image is in the middle of winter. There was a ton of CO2 in the air. And the right, during spring and summer, the leafy green trees absorb much of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So you can see how hard the forests in the north are working. In contemporary building, new growth timber is the only major building material that grows naturally and is renewable. It is sustainable, acts as a carbon sink, and has a low energy of production. Where steel and concrete were the focus of 20th century development in the building industry, we believe that technologically advanced wood products will drive the next wave of innovation. Canadian architecture should be at the forefront of this work. This is a 3-story spec office building of mass timber construction that's currently working its way through the site plan approval process in Toronto, and we're really hoping that it comes out the other end intact and that we can actually achieve the building in timber as it's been designed. Our proposal for the Canadian Prix de Rome, a traveling fellowship we won a few years back, was to research emerging wood technologies and to study the use of digitally fabricated construction, which we had been looking at on the scale of furniture and millwork for years. After we finished our research trip, we mounted an exhibition called Living Wood. The work in the exhibition explores wood's material history with a digital exploration of the effect of mass movement in the landscape on the growth and form of trees. So we commonly think of growth rings as a registration of time, here showing much of human history mapped onto a 1,300-year-old tree. But growth rings can actually also register movement. This slide showing the effect of upslope and downslope orientation on trees in the ring structure. Mass movements can also be caused by other forces like wind or a particularly heavy snow, which is the current hypothesis behind the crooked forest in Poland. The simulation of mass movement in the form of a distorted digital surface is shown here as both a projection and a registration. So we made a surface, then translated that information into 2D in terms of the depth of the cut and the rotation of the center, as you see in those diagrams. Tracings is a 200 square foot grid made up of 288 individual squares of Ontario white maple. Each piece was CNC milled to a depth that registers the angle of a curved surface projected onto its face and the depth. From a distance, one reads the undulating plane registered on the wood surface, and up close, the subtle differences between the pieces become apparent. Now, something you may not know about the City of Toronto is that the city's primary geological feature is a system of large ravines which cut through the city grid. So the ravines here are shown in black. The bottom of the ravine at the Bloor Street Viaduct here, which crosses the Don River, the city's largest watercourse, is 60 meters below the level of the roads and buildings. This urban forest is primarily designated as parkland, largely undeveloped and fiercely protected by local conservation authorities. Buildable lots that back up onto the ravines are prized, and the most valuable land in the city, in a city already known for really high land values and real estate prices. The Don is the large figure in the center, and the naturalization of the mouth of the Don, where it intersects Lake Ontario, is one of the projects that I've been reviewing as a member of the Waterfront Design Review Panel, and is quite close to the Sidewalk Toronto proposal that Christopher touched on yesterday. So I'm particularly interested in seeing what Auckland's doing or not doing on its waterfront, which is such a valuable public asset. Our urban work is spread across the city, ranging from denser interstitial sites in small neighborhoods to ones that back up onto the ravine system. One such project, the Bala Line House, is situated on a ravine with an old rail spur across the bottom. So you can see the neighborhood on top, and it's connected to the site of what's called the Brickworks, which is the factory that literally built all the bricks that built the city of Toronto in through the mid-20th century. So the houses line up along the top of the ravine, and then there's about a 60-meter drop to the conservation area below. The front elevation holds the setback line. And we thought of this house as a block that's been carved away. And this gave us the opportunity to balance like a cheap material with one that is more refined. So the stucco block is carved away, exposing the windows and the timber cladding behind it. We always try to tie details into the line of reasoning for a project. So we also looked at the front bench that you can see in the little 3D picture, the AXO picture, as a block on one side and it's carved away on the other. And here you can also see the house stepping back towards the ravine. In section, a great effort was made to reinforce and replicate the slope of the ravine as it figuratively comes up and into the house. The view towards the ravine from the entry is framed by the kitchen and dining room a half level up. And the framing of the ravine beyond that is through a large double sliding window that opens the back corner of the house. Now, one of the reasons why there are so many large movable windows is not for how it looks, which of course we totally love how it looks, but also because we worked with the client and builder to develop a really light mechanical system. So the house has a warm floor with radiant heat, and there's only a provision for a condensing line, but we didn't install any of the cooling systems into the house when it was built. And the homeowners and their kids have been really committed to opening the house to the environment whenever they can. So as soon as the weather cooperates, they literally erase the lines between the inside and the outside. As issues of sustainability have become a prevailing driver of innovation in the field of architecture, they are often relegated to those values that are empirical, the amount of carbon sequestered, energy used, and lead points. However, what are the measurements that speak to the quality of life as you live in a neighborhood and raise a family that can change the current paradigm of housing for the elderly and allow a family to age in place? Flexibility, community, distance to your local grocery store, the amount of green space that you have. These have become a new set of criteria that we can use to develop solutions to an issue that we're all facing, which is aging. No one can get away from it. Soon after starting this project, we found articles such as this in the Wall Street Journal article on granny flats and the one in Business Week, 3 Generations, 1 Roof, which speaks to the fact that under 10% of households in North America have more than 2 generations living in them. The world's population is aging, and I don't think anyone yet has figured out the right infrastructure to deal with it. As opposed to using the medical model, where we house the elderly in hospital-like retirement homes, we're interested in a version of the home that can accommodate multiple life cycles. In Toronto, the ability to buy into the housing market is challenging. It might not be the question posed here by Metropolis, can we live under one roof? But instead, given that we're going to live under one roof, how do we do it best? So this project began with a blending of 2 households into one. A young family and their son sold their condominium. The parents, getting older, they sold their condominium. And together we constructed this scenario that would allow for autonomy while mutually benefiting each family from the proximity of living together. The site for the house is in a lot in downtown Toronto between Chinatown on the left and Grange Park on the right, which is a newly renovated large urban park situated right behind the Art Gallery of Ontario, so it's a great neighborhood. The existing lot had been in the family for probably 30 years, occupied by a really small, dilapidated single-story duplex. Across the street, we see the neighborhood context, which is a ground floor shop, in this case a hair salon, with 2 stories of apartments above. The neighborhood palette is painted brick, paved front yards, and the Victorian fabric of single-family homes anchored at the corners by similar-sized but more densely occupied buildings with shops below. The other context is Chinatown, just a few blocks away, which provided a vibrant social life for the grandparents, as well as the cheapest vegetables and the favorite restaurants for everyone in the family. The process of developing the site began with a deep dive into the unit types allowed by the City of Toronto. So this provided the raw material for the spatial organization of the project. And so here they are all listed. And then of the building types recognized by the city, and here they are shown diagrammed with different colors for the units, we found that a second suite plus a duplex plus a bed sitting room, which is a housing unit typically used in homes for the aging, provided the right mix of unit types to make it both economically feasible and allowable under this city zoning bylaw, albeit in a slightly unconventional form. So the massing principles are apparent from this view looking south towards the CN Tower. We built to the maximum height, which allowed us to anchor the corner and use what we called democratic fenestration. So all the windows are exactly the same size. So it doesn't privilege one unit over the other, and it intentionally conflates the units, the rental units, live-work units, and the single-family home unit into a single gesture that holds the urban corner. 2 entrances, one on each side, on the left for the family and the right for the rental units. And the entrance on the right corresponds with the green and blue massing shown here, which is a 2-story, 3-bedroom apartment that can be split by floor to allow for 2 separate rental units. Or for aging parents, the ground floor unit, which is in blue, can be combined with the single-family home shown in red. So it's like a little puzzle of units stacked together. The yellow unit is the bed sitting room. So that was the space originally developed for the grandparents and the family. Each unit has a private green space associated with it. Increasing density on the site while at the same time increasing the amount of occupiable green space was a critical development in the project. The extended family shares the courtyard in the back, where the cooking and living spaces are. Each family member has their own private and protected terrace. And I'll just note here the massing on the right with the green space behind it is over the garage. And there's a wall in front of it, but it's open to the sky. And we say the house acts as a blowfish. So it's bigger than it seems because we captured exterior space with the front facade to increase the presence on the street. That green space was designated for the grandparents because they had really specific ideas about exposure and did not want to have their open space on the ground floor. The single-family home that climbs over the stacked units is connected by a straight-run stair with a skylight at the top, allowing for ventilation through the house. So while not explicitly a performative house from a measured sustainability point of view, there were a number of strategies that we employed to tread lightly relative to resource and energy. So the brick facade was made up of leftover bricks. Now, what we did was we called all the brickyards in the city and asked for the remainders, which are like the piles left over from bigger jobs that actually don't get used, which would have otherwise gone to landfill sites. So that's where we got all the brick for the project, and then to unify them afterwards, we painted them white. You'll also notice that we have really small glazing units. In this project, we have an 18% open envelope, which means that there's more wall available for increased insulation. And I've been telling everyone that there's like this massive ice storm in Toronto, so we really need to keep all the heat into the houses, so sometimes small windows is a good thing. The high-efficiency heating and air conditioning systems were broken down by unit, so you could turn them up and down depending on who is there and using them. And I'll quickly just show the plan, this one critical piece. So the family area is on the left here. This is the handicapped accessible rental unit with the door here. Second door to the basement there, so you can split those 2 units. But the critical piece is actually this closet right there. So until the parents need the unit, that's a closet. As soon as mom and dad can't walk up and down stairs anymore and need to move here, which is fully accessible, this wall goes away, the closet goes away, and the accessible unit is connected to the main living, dining, kitchen, family spaces of the house. So that was really the critical piece that made the family comfortable with the flexibility. Basement plan, just showing the rental unit on the right. And the family spaces on the ground floor, which I just talked about, are centered around this little courtyard where the house can open onto this private and protected terrace. We positioned sliding doors so that we could open up that corner to blend the spaces kind of through the outside space. And then this bookshelf stairs, the one custom piece we had, it was a relatively low budget project. Otherwise, we used all out-of-the-box systems like IKEA systems for kitchen and cabinetry. So it was actually a very economical project for the family. So here is Shazan and Ryan and their son Hayden having dinner. And the funny thing is, right before we took this shot, Shazan's dad darted through the picture with takeout from his favorite restaurant around the corner and upstairs to eat in his apartment. So she complains that even though they're all living together, because he's so close to Chinatown and he very much prefers that food to what she and Ryan cook at home, that they never eat together. So for all that work to get the family together, they're actually living quite separate lives. The second floor shows the bed sitting room on the right and Hayden's room on the left. And then this is just a little view of the ground floor apartment with a similar window in the bed sitting room upstairs and the master suite on the third floor. So the straight run stair that connects the ground level to the third floor. And when we started working with the family, there was an imperative to create ways that the family could move around the house privately. So there were these little secret stairs and passages that would cut between spaces so that everyone could come and go discreetly. And I think this really came from Shazan and Ryan feeling like they had to protect their privacy and maintain a life that was separate from their parents' life because they didn't want to feel like they were back in high school and living with mom and dad. And as we worked through the design process, all of this really fell away. And instead, we created spaces that were all shared. And this is also when Mr. Chu claimed the best room in the house for himself. So as we were framing, he saw that the master suite on the third floor had this really big, high, north-facing window, so it was quite private, tons of light. The south had a huge deck with southern light coming in. It was nice and warm. And he thought this was just the space for him. So he and his wife actually moved into the master bedroom, and Shazan and Ryan are kind of down below a little bit. But they're everyone's happy, which is important. As part of the exercise of this project, we developed what we call a visual pro forma, explaining and showing how the total project cost could be amortized over multiple generations. To live multi-generationally strongly suggests a buy-in to forecast the cost and commensurate usage of the home intergenerationally. So the house is configurable, as I explained, to a family's evolving living arrangements. So this 2015 is when the house was done, and so that piece on the end shows the original kind of arrangement. Small family of 3 living in the single-family home with the grandparents and 2 rental apartments. So Shazan's parents, as they age, can move into the ground floor. Hayden, as he gets older, could use it as a student apartment because it's quite near University of Toronto. And recently, Ryan actually moved his business into one of the basement units. So the project's been quite flexible for them and really successful in terms of how they've been using the spaces in very different ways. So the Grange triple-double, which we call it, creates a unique form for multi-unit housing development in Toronto that would not have been possible without the profound engagement of the client and the opportunities discovered in the city's bylaws. So it kind of confirms that modern details can be contextualized through materials and finishes to create housing that embraces new ways of living in old neighborhoods. So as the family changes, so can the family home. The house on Ancaster Creek is our most recently completed intergenerational home for a couple and the aging parents of one of the couple. Ancaster Creek and its floodplain traverse the property in the back. This site is one of 600 private properties that accommodate forest, wetland, meadow, aquatic habitat in this protected area. And the house is located at the back of the property in close proximity to the creek while respecting the meander line to avoid the floodplain and erosion hazards of the watercourse. The house was conceived as 2 distinct residences. So on the right in the diagram, there's the left with library, kitchen, living, dining, ensuite, and on the right, kitchen, living, dining, ensuite, extra rooms, and the garage. So they sit perpendicular to each other, creating a little landscape forecourt in the front, and they stack in the corner. The parent suite occupies the ground floor, and you can see that the ground floor is on the left and the second floor is on the right. In the parent suite's the big bar that starts at the view and works back to the garage. The suite is laid out as a single floor accessible apartment with added features to accommodate the specific challenges facing the aging parents. Among them, well-located drains and a master power switch to help mitigate issues that have come with memory loss. Sinks left running, ovens left on, and things like that. A second bedroom are adjacent to that suite, but separate for a live-in relative or a nurse. Running parallel to the creek is the main residence. So the kitchen on the right anchors the south end of the house. Set in a double height volume, the 20-foot tall pyramidal ceiling creates an expansive space that opens up onto the creek, the courtyard, and above to the sky. The dining room occupies a glazed link, as shown here in the model, between the landscape that flows up from the creek through the courtyard and to the front of the house. Early in the design process, the clients told us that they never used their current dining room except on holidays, and the space was essentially wasted. So we developed this idea of making the dining room more like a passageway. And now, so they would always pass through it, it wouldn't go unused, and they would move between the kitchen and the living room through the space. So now, given the light and the views, they actually use the space every day, which is something they never expected and really enjoy, which is a really nice outcome for us that we're pretty pleased with. The living room extends under the cantilever and in the summer months can effectively double in size. And these social spaces are shared by the extended family. So here's Ben on the right, Michael, and Ben's mother on the left. The grand gesture of a wood-clad spiral staircase connects the living room to the second floor master suite, creating a unique moment in the otherwise orthogonal room and celebrating the connection between the floors. The curvature rises and opens at the same time and becomes the ceiling of the hallway down to the left, which leads to the parents' apartment. The stair is structured with sheets of laminated plywood. The white oak railings become really thin, like 2 inches or less, curved structural elements that bridge between the floors. The complexity of the system is seen in the connections between the layers, with two sides tied together by the treads, effectively creating the tight inner spiral as a post. The way it connects to the adjacent wall created an opportunity to express this material weaving that happens in this area. The small second floor above acts as a private suite. There's a lounge with a concealed bar that extends from this large landing. There's a library space, and a light-filled cantilevered bedroom reaches out to the best views of the creek. With sustainability was a really important part of the design process for this project. So material durability and longevity were really important. The ground floor of the house on the back is glass, but on the front it's clad in locally quarried Algonquin limestone, which meanders around the perimeter of the house. The coursing was designated to highlight the compression and layering of the stone. So they're 12 inches tall at the top and 4 inches at the bottom. And then, just like Frank Lloyd Wright, we kind of filled all the horizontal joints and filled the vertical joints and raked the horizontal joints really deep so that you could kind of read the striation. Milled cedar cladding is on the upper layer of the house. 1x6 cedar boards were milled with 3/4 thick grooves to create a much kind of more shadow line, kind of a more playful shadow. And while we didn't model the energy use of the house during design, we took the first year and collected all the data to see where our common sense approach to reducing energy consumption had gotten us. So most importantly, 2 families are now living on one site, so we kind of eliminated one home. The envelope is highly insulated, triple pane windows, automated shades drop down during the hot parts of the day. And finally, a 10 kilowatt solar array was installed on the flat roofs, which really offset energy consumption. So if you actually tally the amount of gas and hydro that this house used in a year, you can calculate the EUI. So I'm not sure how many in the room are familiar with the energy use index number. This house has a number of 94, whereas a single-family home in this permit year was around 235 or something like that. So this house actually met the metrics for the 2030 challenge for carbon reduction for the year in which it was built, which was, I think, about 60%. And we were really happy with that. Now, the 2030 challenge, I'm sure you all know, especially in North America, is full carbon reduction by the year 2030. The metrics are getting more and more harder and harder to achieve. And what we realized that with this house, that the common sense approach to sustainability was only going to take us so far, that it will take modeling projects and kind of over and above measures to actually get it down to net zero. Back to Toronto. So as much as Toronto is on a tear with high-rise building, so last year Toronto topped the Crane Index in all of North America by a lot over Seattle, Toronto is very much a city of houses, with zoning not allowing increased density on the narrow Victorian lots that make up the fabric of the city. This leads to projects we affectionately refer to as the Toronto mullet. Located in the low-density area fabric of the city, so you see the core comes up Yonge Street, which is kind of like your Queen Street, and it's where all the tall buildings are, central business district on the right. The majority of the city is actually two-story homes, like really, really low-lying neighborhood fabric. So these projects tend to be a solution to high land value, poor condition of the existing housing stock, and the ever-increasing cost of construction, which I hear is something that you're all dealing with as well here in Auckland. So the idea of a starter home doesn't exist anymore in Toronto. So families are adding where they can, and this usually means to the back. So the Toronto mullet is Victorian on the front and like open and glassy and modern on the back. And this is everywhere throughout the entire city. The connective tissue between the two sides is something that we try to find some kind of a moment in and try to exploit. In this case, it's a stair that channels light down through the center of the house. Here's another one. This is the charming Victorian on the front, and a big kind of big glassy window over the stucco box on the back. And here again, we're shaping the volume on the back, cracking it open so you can see in the model on the right the bit of light that's getting into the middle. The sites are actually quite long, so like my own house is 15 feet wide and my lot's 120 feet long. So you get these really long, skinny houses. You need to get light into the center. And here the homeowner on left and right and their child, he actually works from home, so he's a graphic designer. And that's his office up top, and then him with his daughter there on the right. We really like working in our own neighborhood, and we think that everyone should be able to afford to use an architect as opposed to it being a luxury item. Mark for example, is a graphic designer, and his wife is a postal worker. She delivers mail. These projects tend to be simple and really good value, which is secret code for stucco and drywall, which are literally the two cheapest things that you can make a house out of in Toronto. But they're no less work for our office than a big custom residential home, which is why we can't take on every client that calls wanting a project like this, because it would not be sustainable financially for our office. I wanted to show one project in schematic design so that you could see the early stages of how we craft an idea. And then in 2021, you can check back on Twitter. I'll tweet out on Instagram and Twitter the images of what it looks like to see if it turned out the way we all think. So these clients are the slightly amped up version of our neighborhood friends that we like to work with. The house is for a painter and a shoring contractor, which I know sounds like a student project, but we feel like we really got lucky with this one. So Kelly is a painter, and her work is on the left, and her day job is making scenery for the Canadian Opera. Otherwise, she paints landscapes. Her partner, Tobin, is a shoring contractor whose company works in the Toronto high-rise tower market and has done very well in the last number of years. So large-scale elements of the construction industry, beams and piles and yards of concrete, are his raw material that kind of inspired his imagination. So the right is a picture from the yard in the back of his kind of company, and he said, you can use anything back here. So we're walking around taking pictures of all the steel and wood pieces. Together they find beauty in tough and natural elements used to retain earth, while reinterpreting the natural landscape into abstract form with their sense of light and space. The site for this house is in Toronto's East End, in an area called the Scarborough Bluffs. As late as the turn of the 20th century, the Scarborough Bluffs retreated at a rate of nearly a meter a year. So that's the slide on the upper left. The sand from erosion was swept down, and that's what formed the Toronto Islands at the base of the Don River. Yet by the early 1960s, urban sprawl had claimed the area. And you can see in the map on the bottom, it's a really early map showing the houses, which conservation authorities moved in to slow the erosion, which was sending houses toppling over the edge and threatening many more. So the greened cliffs on the right, while they look appropriately natural, are actually the destruction of the natural ecosystem and cycle of erosion in this area, which is something that we found really fascinating. Most of the narrow natural beaches have disappeared, while the slopes above have become more gradual and much more treed. Slope stability in this natural environment is an artifice, yet it becomes the new nature and is protected as such. Homes on this now protected edge can be viewed in the exact same light. The house is organized around 4 concrete volumes. There's a rendered wood model on the right. There's kind of like the shoring walls that rise above grade and become a series of light receptors, each figured to the program that they'll be housing. They're topped with operable windows, so we can get some breezes up and through the house, with shading on the south side to modulate the light. Those kind of in orange would be the concrete volumes. These are 2 little 3D printed models, really teeny ones we did in our office. They capture this framed second floor, which would be made in timber and clad in weathered cedar. And then you combine that with the defined negative spaces, the green spaces you kind of get the big picture of the house. It's a series of plans that I won't really walk through, but showing that foundation on the left, and then the first floor plan in the white area, you can kind of see how the boxes, the concrete boxes, are filled with program, and as they come up, they get the X's, which means they're just kind of rising up empty and end up into the skylights on the 3rd floor. So the north side of the house, which is this, 1 volume marks the entry threshold, and inside it holds the support program, and then there's an office space with light coming in on top. And in the middle, a pair of concrete volumes anchor the center of the home, double height at the dining room, capturing southern light through a clear story and creating shadow play on the walls. On the east side, the other volume opens up onto the 2nd level for the painting studio, which was required to have even north light to work and elevation above the tree line so Kelly could have a view of Lake Ontario. So here's Kelly on the left. And we added VR modeling into our practice about a year ago, which is incredibly helpful because we loaded up all the ceiling and light models on the right into the digital model. She put on the goggles and was able to walk through her painting studio and see when light hit a wall, if it was right, if it was not, like what the softness that she liked was working for her. And it was actually it was both hilarious and really, really useful from a client point of view. The volume and this is just a potential section. We haven't quite decided on what that's going to be. The 4th volume is the one on the left there, is at the rear of the house, anchors the living dining space with a master above. It defines an exterior courtyard that's inside the space of the house that creates a pocket of green and provides privacy between the bedroom and the 2nd floor living room with a deck. By breaking down the intersection of the concrete volumes and the 2nd floor spaces, cross views emerge with connections to the ground floor and the sky above. Light fills the house and will kind of make the concrete read both planar and volumetric at times and catch the movement of the sun throughout the day. So catching, reflecting, diffusing light is one of the things that we're really kind of looking into this project. And we've just sort of finished schematic design and we're moving into DD, and this will be under construction next year. Canada has a fairly young cultural history. When most Canadians think of timber construction, they think of rustic, like knotty pine, log cabins and things. And I love the magazine. It's enchanting to step back in time. And that means go to your cottage in the woods. This idea ties into the mythological presence of the landscape in Canada. Take this example. This is a quintessential Canadian image depicting a freshwater lake in the Canadian Shield. It references the geological history of the Canadian landscape. The Muskoka chairs are, for Canadians in particular, iconic references for how we use this landscape for leisure and recreational activities. It's as much a domesticated view of landscape as it is a natural phenomenon. There's both an appreciation of the natural, and you absolutely get bonus points if you bring back a picture of a moose after having gone to your cottage, like, no doubt. It's also an abstraction of the natural. Part of the responsibility for this, the presence of landscape in the Canadian psyche belongs to the Group of Seven, which were a group of landscape painters at the turn of the century who sought to depict the Canadian landscape in a way that it had never been seen before. You can see a kind of array of their work. They kind of pursued abstraction and invention in representation. And here you see the painting on the left and then the landscape it was derived from on the right. Now, somehow, this leads to occupying the landscape just like this. This house could literally be anywhere. Our first commission was a cottage, your batches, in 2 hours outside of Toronto. It's where you enter cottage country. And I don't think I'm going too far in saying that Canadians really romanticize the cottage experience. And maybe it's because the winters are so long and cold and hard that when it's time to spend time outdoors, like everyone really takes advantage of it. The house on Frogs Hollow is a 180 square meter cottage built on the northern slope of the Niagara Escarpment, just south of Georgian Bay, which you see a bit of at the top of the slide. It's on 100 acres of eroded clay hills and protected watershed zones, blanketed with a dense field of hawthorn, really prickly, and native grasses. So the landscape was not really picturesque, but really tough. And when we started the project, the site was undeveloped, so no road, water, hydro, anything. The client really couldn't even wrap her head around the lot being livable. It was a family of avid cyclists. So you see the hills on the site. They spent months on the site camping and cutting in cycling, like mountain biking trails prior to construction, learning the paths of the snowmobiles and horses from the community as they emerged over the seasons. The site was really large, but the only usable land was fairly close to the road because the rest was all in protected watershed zones, which are non-buildable areas. Because of the family's connection to the landscape, the primary site strategy was to resist the inclination to build on the top of the hill, from where you could see the whole thing, but actually embed the house into the hill, carving out an area so that the house wasn't the final destination, but just a stopping point on the many paths that move through the property. The design of the project began with development of this long concrete wall, which was the main organizing element. It figuratively cleared the site for construction. It had a robustness that mirrored the landscape and protected the house from prevailing winds, which come right across that corner. The space behind the wall we deemed the service bar. So it held the kitchen, all the service elements, computer, work area, bike shop, mechanical space, and we took it right into the hillside as far as we could. The second floor bedroom block is a nearly opaque volume. There are 4 rooms with a window for each room at the corners, and the idea conceptually is that this block creates the shade below, which is the Glaston living space. So the delineation of the living space is actually in the shadow cast by the upper volume. Now, one of the obvious iconic aspects of the project is the fact that it's embedded in the landscape. And often when we talk about this, and especially when we talk to students about this, there's the notion that embedding something in the landscape is somehow a way to tread lightly on the landscape. It's a small gesture. It's about tying architecture together to the land. But in reality, it's a very different thing. And when you build up north, and it's me with the contractor, Mike, the contractors are they're real loose cannons. So they thought absolutely nothing of doing a 14-foot straight cut into the hill. And, that's totally illegal, by the way. We did have clay soil that was relatively stiff and to withstand the cut, so they thought they would just go for it. And then 2 days after a massive rainstorm, Mike called me up and he said, "We lost the tree." And I said, meaning that tree right there, which is a tree that our client Merle was quite fond of for no really good reason. I said, "Well, how did you lose the tree?" And he said, well, there was a giant rainstorm, and if we didn't bulldoze the side of the hill, we were going to lose the entire hill. Like, this is all going to come crashing into the cut. And I said, it's going to be a very interesting conversation I have to have with a client. Basically, all she wanted was this little 180 square meter house, and the architects come along, and all of a sudden we're bulldozing away like the tallest hill on her property. But the reason we did this is when we designed the footings and foundation for the house, although we didn't plan on a deep excavation, it became much cheaper to build that way. So we designed footings that were stepped to sit 4 feet below grade, below the frost line, and we only wanted to use as much concrete as you would see. Putting in stepped footings made a lot of sense to us as architects, but made no sense to the builder, who could build much cheaper with commercial forms that all came in one length. So the value of the material was much less than the energy it took for stepping the foundation. On the side where that concrete wall is, it's buried up to like 2 inches at the top, so it's almost all underground. The formwork for commercial foundation was used. It was a reused steel form, so they're really junky looking. So one of the details that we added was to board form the wall. And here, economy was actually a real issue, so they only used the longest scrap boards they had lying around site to line the commercial forms, and they only put the board in where you would actually see it exposed. And in the final project, you see that the land is now all back in place, and the project is truly embedded. It took a tremendous amount of effort to get it there. This image really tells the story of the project. As an early work in our office, it set up the themes that we have continued to explore, such as site relationships, material richness, and moments of engagement where there is detailed development in proximity to the human body, particularly in section and where you're moving through the house, like taking stairs, railings, and things that you touch. This is the ground floor space with the glassed-in living room tucked underneath the red box above. This was a really economical project. It was $250 Canadian per square foot in the year it was built, which was a number of years ago. That is not applicable today. So I think I was chatting this morning, I think our costs are very much in line with your costs right now in terms of custom homes. The house is a 4-season house heated with radiant heat from an on-demand electric resistance heater. There's no air conditioning and no ductwork, so that really helped pull the cost down. A really light, fresh air system. The radiant floor allowed us to just polish the slab, so there's no basement, just a polished slab. All the windows were commercial windows, so we took the maximum size they had and kind of played with it a bit in section. So there's a few things that you can actually do with really not very expensive materials and systems to make it a house really special. We had created the patio outside, which expands the living space during the nicer months, used in summer and swing seasons. And due to watershed zone restrictions and the fact that there was really no flat land on the site, in order to have any outside space, we had to kind of make a paved area. Early on in our practice, we started these experiments with wood and fabrication because it's light, cheap, and machinable. In particular, we looked at wood in our early work because we thought its suppleness contrasted with the curvature and with the natural material. And we also kind of fell in love with the artifacts of machining. So the idea for this project began to develop a skin for the building that could register the sun as it moved around the house, a skin that would make shadows. The cladding is made up of pine boards. This is a 1/3 scale mock-up on the right. The cladding pieces are 10 feet tall, which is exactly as long as we could fit on our CNC milling machine, and had an extra deep section, 2.5 inch thickness actual. The widths of the board range from 2.5 inches wide to 8 inches, and the narrow boards were milled really shallow, and the wider boards were milled really deep, so that it kind of changes and undulates as it goes around the house. One of the things that you have to be really careful with when you do a fabrication piece in your project is to optimize the build. So you could very well have spent a very long time milling these out, we were able to optimize it so that the boards were on and off the bed in about 3 minutes each. There were 325 of them, so it didn't take that long to actually do the fabrication. And we figured it out so that we actually kind of went in as an office, produced them all in an afternoon, and then handed it off to the builder. The siding is what's called Fallon Red, which is Swedish barn paint. It's an iron oxide pigment suspended in linseed oil. It impregnates the wood, so it's not paint, it can't flake off, and it really just colors the house. It's basically the rust color that you use to treat wood. The other opportunity that we had here for fabricated work in the project was the stair. The idea behind the stair was to filter light into the house. It was also to carve into the volume below the treads to create a bit more space because it was a relatively small home. We designed the millwork in the house to be all in birch, birch veneer. The treads and railings of the stair are built out of solid birch, and constructed the curved elevation out of profile sections to get that really beautiful exposed edge, put together kind of small sections of 5, and then worked with the carpenter on site to actually install it. Then the last little piece is a very, very small detail, which is the one mechanical component. Instead of putting a fresh air vent, we calculated the amount of holes you would need in a board. So all the fresh air vents in the house are these little custom figured boards, which we thought was both beautiful and a functional component. So just to wrap up, so this is the part where I'm going to really pander to the local crowd. So while all of our work is in the Toronto area, our very best clients are from Wellington. So Andy here is the owner of Pilot Coffee Roasters. He and his brother, Rob, and Michelle, Rob's wife, are all from Wellington. I think Andy fell in love and moved to Canada. And so they set up the first roastery in Toronto with an open tasting bar incorporated into it. So they're own the coffee shop in our neighborhood, and seriously, they have the best coffee in the entire city. So we would go there a lot, got to know them. They asked us to renovate their house, which we did, and then afterwards they said, oh, we have this great, we're going to open a roastery. We're thinking about behind this building, back behind the Greenwood rail yards. So we went and looked at it on the left. It's zoned industrial land, so it's never going to be housing, so has never been scooped up by a developer. And they bought it, and we started on the first of about 9 projects that we've done with them. First creating this coffee bar, which we modeled on the old New York chock full of nuts bars, which were just leaving the city when I was a student there, where all the coffee machinery is down below. So they were the first to have the mod bar in Canada. They have servers come and you chat with them. It's like this really kind of lovely experience. So we kind of shaped this as a big unwrapped paperclip. They were the first cold brew production facility in, this is a huge pitch for Pilot Coffee, so they pay me a little bit more, I think. So the first cold brew production in the city, so we did this work. And then when the spaces got too packed below, they needed a new admin space up top. So here we had already done all the work downstairs, couldn't puncture to the ground floor with columns, so we had this big truss that bridged between the concrete block and then hung the floor above the old roof. So the old roof continues through underneath the addition, nothing punctures it. And I have to tell you, if you want to make your structural engineers really happy, say that we are not only not going to cover any of your work, we're going to paint it bright yellow so that everyone can see what you've done. And they looked at me and they said, the 90s are coming back. And I said, so maybe, maybe not. We'll see how that goes. I love the 90s, don't get me wrong. So the space is their admin offices. It's light, airy. It's also their kitchen and lunchroom for their employees. So this was, like I said, one of many projects. This is their home office. We also have done all of their cafes in the city. So it started with this little tiny coffee cart where we figured out how to make a rolling unit that has all the production spaces within it. So there's water and pumps and wastewater, and all you have to do is roll this into a space and plug it in, and you've got your espresso going. So this was the first thing that we did, because every project every architect has to do a container project. We made a version of it, put it in a container, shipped it out to Prince Edward County. And this was also when we started to really iterate with them on the conceptualizing what their brick and mortar presence was going to be. So this actually shows their old logo on the right, which was a circle with pilot written in it. And because they're pilot, we thought, well, airplanes, this makes perfect sense. So we made another mobile cart that can be moved around to different places in downtown Toronto, and made a little cover for it so it could be closed down during the day and shaped the top like a paper airplane. They really liked that a lot, so they started incorporating that into their other projects. So their logo on the right is now a little airplane. So achieving success in design and success in delivery means that each project that we've done for them has to further the idea of the brand, which means creating an atmosphere that's light and energetic and where customers enjoy the experience as much as where the staff is happy to work. They have given us the freedom to iterate, so they really trust us to do what we do best. They know what they do best, and it's kept the projects really interesting. It's really nice. They never put the brakes on us when we're running with an idea. The projects, because it's commercial, are really quick. They have to come in on tight budgets, which are both kind of nice, because if one of our houses can take 3 years, kind of average, rarely shorter than that. It's nice to have projects that are really kind of fast and moving in and out of the office in 6 to 8 months. We developed a palette of materials and color, plant material, lighting that was clean and open and refined, simple but with special details so you can see all the moments of engagement throughout the projects. And that is the end. Thank you so much.
Give Lindley a chance to come up. Thank you so much
for thank you.
Terrific presentation. Funnily enough, I have a picture on my phone. I was just in Toronto, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to walk by the Triple Double project and have several pictures on my phone. I really admired it, not actually knowing who the architect was. So now it's nice to hear.
It's total kismet.
To hear the story. One quick question. I think, like many in the audience, I was struck by the precision and craft of the work, and particularly the amazingly beautiful models, and the models in a variety of materials. So can you just describe in a little more detail the process and how you're working from the models all the way through AR, as you mentioned? VR, sorry.
Well, it takes a lot of time and energy to make them, and we really have to force ourselves to do it. So a few things that we've put in place to make it slightly easier is we bought a 3D printer a number of years ago, which I'm sure many of you have, so we can produce the little ones really fast. Everyone is so used to looking and working through plan, section, elevation, and then 3D modeling. So we have our workflow is really an AutoCAD Rhino workflow, and then everything goes into Revit. So because you're so facile, and you never really have the energy and money to do these, we have to literally force ourselves to stop the process, build the model, and look at it. So these are relatively finessed, that come a bit later in the stages of work, kind of after we know what's happening. The models that I didn't show are the foam core, really rough sketch models with paper laminated all over them. And like I said, it just takes a huge amount of effort to actually bring them into the workflow, because we find they help so much understanding the shape and form of a project. If something doesn't look right when you draw it or make a model of it, there's no magic, as you all know, that happens when it's built. It's not going to look right when it's built. So the more you do, the better the work gets. And so it's just one of those things that we have to really make time for. Yeah.
My question is a bit more pragmatic. No question that the work and the models are beautiful. But in the couple of days that we've spent together, I've been incredibly impressed by your ability to balance practice management, including invoicing. Betsy does all the invoicing herself, but also most of the procuring of jobs, all the marketing essentially, plus clearly spending a lot of time up front in design, and obviously managing the people, your people. Yeah. Can you give us any kind of insight as to how you managed to achieve all that?
For sure. So it's really, I think I said in the breakfast session this morning that when I was in school, I had a thought that I kind of figured that I knew what architects did. And architects drew and made projects and then built the projects. When you get into the profession, you understand that it's so much more complicated than that. I think I've always kept our office really small because I don't want to ever be too far from this idea of what I want to do with my life. So if it gets to the point where I'm not drawing and kind of working things out, I'm not going to feel right. Like it's just, that's what I want to do. So how do I shape everything and put it together to make that happen? So we hire, of the 6 people on how many were on the screen? So we have, besides myself, we have 3 registered architects. So everyone in our practice is actually really highly experienced. We have a few younger people that kind of come in, circulate through, flow in and out to assist them, but you need to have the confidence that your staff can actually move something forward when you're not there. So there's a huge amount of trust that gets built over the years. This might be the super boring part of the answer. We use great software programs, as I was telling you on the walk over. So we've set up, there's a program called Podio where we do all of our internal communication that gets posted. So I literally have all the major decisions in my pocket at any time. I can look at them if I'm in a meeting at Waterfront or wherever I am. There's a great system developed in North America called ArchiOffice, which does all the billing. So we were pretty smart in how we developed all the software that we use to create workflows that are really effortless, which helps immensely. If I had to struggle through any of these things, I just wouldn't do them. And it's about, there was one professor that I had when I was a graduate student named Chris Risher, who was this older Southern gentleman, that's a real character. And he didn't tell us at the time, but he had purposely given us way too much work than we can handle. And at the end, he said, I just wanted to see what each of you was going to prioritize, because you're always going to have too much to do. What is it that you're going to choose to bring to the front? So I could easily spend all my time doing this or that or the other thing, but I've consciously figured how to prioritize the things that I think make our practice stronger and the things that I actually really like to do. And that's sort of how we all keep it together.
Because of course I didn't touch on the work that Betsy's doing outside of her office, although except in the introduction. And she also commented about that added into the mix, plus a family. She just regards it all as one lump. She's decided that's the best strategy.
Well, it looks like we're almost over time. John, do we have time for one more question maybe? Or I'm very curious about mass timber, and of course a lot of cities, including Los Angeles, are looking to that as the future for sustainable construction. From your point of view, what will need to happen from, let's say, a regulatory point of view to actually make it acceptable as a form for mass building in North American cities, let's say? Sure.
Well, the movement to 6 stories has been really huge. So I know Canada's moving there. I'm not sure whether the States is moving there. I think in Portland and in the Pacific Northwest, they've actually gone there already. So that type of regulation means that it's much easier for firms to not have to go through the hoops and get special permission to do all the work. So that's number one. Second is getting really competent fabricators in North America. So Canada just has set up its first couple of plants. And if you speak to people in the industry, specifically in the Vancouver area, where they've done a lot more of this for much longer, and I said, well, if I had to order it from somebody, like who would we use? And they said, go to Austria, because they have really figured out the systems. They know how to put them together. Everything is clean and tight and really well detailed. And the Canadian fabrication facilities just aren't there yet. They can make a whole bunch of deck and ship it to you, but then it's just a pile of deck sitting on the ground, so it doesn't get up into a building. So I think putting money into the fabrication is really important. We have a very close relationship with Ontario Woodworks, who is actually trying to do that, and they give grants to architects to offset the cost of the extra amount of work you have to do to make the system happen. I know there's been a couple of competitions, not really competitions, but grant programs in the States where you could propose a super tall building and get funds to help offset the work that goes into making something distinctive. What's really interesting is that Sidewalk wants to do a full timber district. And we sit on the panel, and none of us are easy on them, which is, kind of the way it goes.
Good for you. Yes.
And but there's a guy named Fadi on the panel who's this young landscape teacher at U of T who's just really brilliant. And they had presented the mass timber part, and they said, "Oh, we're going to bring all this industry to Canada and all this stuff." And the U.S. is one of the only countries that still use feet and inches. They had presented all of their research in feet and inches, and he said, "Well, excuse me, if you're bringing all this industry to Toronto, how come you're not figuring it out in centimeters and meters? Like, how come you're in feet and inches?" And we thought, hey, are you actually doing this in the States and not bringing it up here? And the questioning just like went off on a curve, and they were like, oh my God, But it was a really astute question. Like, the promise of that development is that they're going to bring up the timber industry. But then they say at the same time, oh, but Canada can't quite handle it yet, so we're trying to figure this out in another way. So,
Terrific. So I think it's time for our tea break.
great.
I was going to say that I think the same issues are in New Zealand. It's potentially something that New Zealand could do really well, but it's really in its infancy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Betsy and Christopher. And thank you again to the sponsor of Betsy's presentation, Metalcraft Roofing.